Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here. I was asked to talk about, let's see, which one is the mouse? I was asked to talk about the trade-offs between human and environmental health from a meat perspective. Now, I'm not a health specialist, but I'm an environmental specialist, and you will find that health plays only a very minor role in my talk. I was particularly asked to talk about the environmental impacts of beef, pork, and poultry and how they compare. Now, this is a question that's not easy to answer, and in fact, we are analyzing how all these different species compare right now. I'm the chairman of a United Nations FAO partnership on livestock environmental assessment and performance. This is basically a project that helps us to establish the methodology to find out what is the environmental impact of livestock across species. So all the livestock species, we are basically trying to harmonize the methodology to come up with the environmental impacts for all the different regions in the world, but also within regions, differences across producers. We want to establish an internationally agreed upon scientific methodology, and that will then help us to assess what potential mitigation would be effective. It brings together, this project brings together many governments, national governments, but also the entire livestock and poultry sector worldwide. So they're all included in this project, as are NGOs, like the World Wildlife Fund and others. So all of these different partners have come together in the belief that what is really missing is a methodology to find out what the environmental impacts are of the livestock sector globally. I want to point out to a slide that many of you are aware of. Everybody here talks about the global world population increasing sharply by 2050. You see on the x-axis the years 1750 to 2050. But what's really special about this slide is that it, by color, segregates the developed countries from the developing countries. When I was a little boy, we had about 3.5 billion people in the world. 3.5. Now we have 7, and once I'm an old man, we will have 9.3 billion people in the world. So throughout my lifetime, the world human population will have tripled. Will have tripled. Now, that has led the FAO to really study the resource issue around the animal protein sector. What they portrayed on this slide here is a distribution of livestock globally. What you see is that while you might think of the United States as a heavy hitter livestock producing area, it's really India and China that's growing the fastest and that has, even today, the largest numbers of livestock. What's more dramatic is this slide. This slide here shows in color all of those areas in the world that have arable land. Land that can be used to grow crops or animals for human consumption. Whether we have 3.5 or 7 or 9 or 12 billion people in the world, this is what limits us. And any kind of sustainable solution that we come up with has to be able to allow us to make the best use of this land. A few slides that I obtained from my colleagues from the FAO, just showing some general trends. Consumption is growing rapidly in developing countries, and consumption of animal protein is meant here. You see eggs and meat and milk throughout the years on the x-axis. It's generally driven by incomes. The more disposable income people have, the higher are their consumption patterns with respect to meat. So the greater the disposable income, the higher the consumption levels. And the lower the disposable income, the lower the consumption levels. Meat production is growing particularly in parts of East and Southeast Asia, but also in Latin America. And milk production is following the same trend, particularly in South Asia. Now, what's also growing is the general political pressure, particularly in countries of the developed world. We often hear comparisons of the livestock sector with transportation, where people say, if you eat a burger a week, that's worse than driving a Hummer. Or your transportation choices are really not that consequential as long as you eat the right diet, and so on. There's a lot of confusion out there. There's a lot of confusion out there, and while most scientists would agree that your food choices are an important component, they also would agree that it pales compared to transportation choices or energy production and use choices. I just give you one example from the current emission inventory from the EPA here in this country. The total contribution of energy production and use in this country is 31%. So 31% of all greenhouse gases are associated with the production of energy and the use of energy. 26% are related to the use of transportation sector, 26%. And the entire livestock sector with all species, and that's done as a life cycle assessment, contributes 3.4%. So if we were to tease out of those 3.4%, what is the contribution, let's say, of beef, then we would arrive very likely at a number around 1.4%. So approximately 1.4% of the total contributions of greenhouse gases in this country come from the beef sector. And I just want to give you that example because some people say, well, let's go Meatless Monday, this will save our planet. Let's just do the math. If we have 300 plus million people going meatless, going, let's say, beefless on Mondays, then that would mean that 1.4% of the total beef carbon footprint would be cut by a factor of 7. So that's a 0.2 reduction of the total greenhouse gas footprint that we have in this country. So while this is not nothing, it certainly is something, it will not even compare to what we see from the transportation sector. We see a lot of public policy campaigns all over the world. This one is from Sweden, from a fast food chain. It shows 3 burgers, a tofu burger, a turkey burger, and a beef burger, and those blue bubbles associated with the burgers are not the prices, but the carbon footprints. So people are more and more interested in what are the environmental consequences of their food choices. This slide here I particularly like from our friends at Toyota. It shows a sheep and it shows a Prius and then a scale as to who is greener. So again, a couple of slides from my colleagues from FAO that show that the environmental performance of livestock varies greatly throughout the world. Here you see the Netherlands, India, and Brazil, and the differences between the dairy herd of these countries. The dairy herd in the Netherlands is much lower with respect to its carbon footprint compared to India or Brazil. The same is true for the beef herd, which again is much lower in the Netherlands compared to its developing peers. Why is that? It has a lot to do with efficiency. The average cow, just to give you an example, the average cow in California, where I live, produces approximately 20,000 pounds of milk per year. The average cow, same breed, but the average cow just across the border in Mexico produces 4,000 pounds of milk per year. So it takes 5 Mexican cows to produce the same amount of milk as 1 California cow. And the reason why this matters is because these 5 cows in Mexico produce way more waste as a group, much more enteric gases. They need more land, significantly more land, and much more water. They consume more feed. They are less efficient, and that decrease in efficiency directly affects its environmental impact. If I were to add India to this picture, I would have to paint 20 cows to equal 1 California cow. So now you ask yourself, well, why would that be? Well, think about how cows are housed in India. They kind of walk around the neighborhood and find whatever they find. They are not bred for high merit. They are not fed according to their genetic potentials. Nobody cares whether they have parasites in them or not. All of these issues definitely determine the efficiency of those animals. What is very, very clear today to us scientists in this field is that there's a strong relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and not just milk, but in this case, milk output. The same is true for meat as well. This slide shows on the x-axis the output of milk per cow in fat and protein-corrected milk from little production to high production. And on the y-axis, the total amount of greenhouse gases per kilogram of fat and protein-corrected milk. The less a cow produces, the higher is its carbon footprint. And the more a cow produces, the lower is its carbon footprint. Same is true for beef, the same is true for most livestock species. This is something that's largely unknown to the public, but it is really undisputable that performance of animals is directly related to the environmental efficiency. So what we know is that in developed countries like Paraguay or African countries or so, in developed countries like the United States or Europe, greenhouse gases are relatively dwarfed with respect to total carbon footprint contributions. And that's because the other sectors are so large. So if you express greenhouse gases as percent of a society, that percentage would be low in a country like the United States, whereas it would be very high in a developing country because there the other sectors are much smaller. And the reason why I bring this up is because oftentimes you find global averages. You find global numbers. One number that's very famous is that a report once said that livestock contributes to 18% of all greenhouse gases, more than transportation. That was a global number, and that global number spanned all livestock species, but that was not the problem. The big problem was that the comparison between livestock and transportation was really not appropriate because livestock was analyzed with a life cycle assessment, a total life cycle assessment, but transportation was only analyzed with tailpipe emissions, not with the production of cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, roads, airports, getting oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, shipping it, refining it, and then burning it, but only burning it. And that report made it all into our media, and that's why public policy decisions have been made, like Meatless Mondays and so forth. So again, this is from an early FAO report here. It shows developing regions on the left versus developed regions on the right. And it shows here particularly the years 1990 to 2020. What you see in blue and green are total greenhouse gases in developing versus developed regions. What you see is that while in developed regions in the world, greenhouse gases are plateauing, in developing regions, they are increasing pretty sharply. And that's because the herds are growing. And they're growing drastically, very fast. This is a comparison of different regions in the world, again from FAO. On the x-axis are the regions, on the y-axis, greenhouse gases per fat and protein-corrected milk unit. You see North America across the world has the lowest carbon footprint per unit of milk produced. Now, why is this? Again, it is because our herds have veterinary care, minimizing parasite loads. They have genetic high merit. That means they produce a lot per cow. It also means that nutrition of those animals is optimized so that the animals produce as much as possible. There is a clear, and I said this before, a clear link between production efficiency and not just methane, but overall environmental emissions. But let me give you some examples. If you compare 1944 with 2007 dairies, so old versus new dairies in the United States, then you find that new dairies consume 20% less or need 20% less animals, 23% less feed, 35% less water, and 10% less land to produce the same billion gallon of milk. At the same time, the modern versus the old dairy produces 43% less methane and almost 60% less nitrous oxide, another very potent greenhouse gas, to produce the same amount of milk. That's important to show you how effective or how meaningful efficiencies are in reducing environmental impact. That's not to say that everything that is used in this country is where we need to be. In fact, high performance of animals has also led us into situations that are not sustainable. For example, in the dairy sector, we have large problems with having so much performance of cows that we now run into reproductive performance, that we have issues getting cows pregnant. And if you have issues getting cows pregnant, then that means you need to have more replacement animals. Animals that are currently not milking, but waiting to go into the milking herd. And these animals eat and excrete, but don't produce milk. So there are definitely environmental issues that we have. Now, some people will say, and I'm sure that this commission here will come up with this topic, that we should just replace more and more replace conventional with organic production. From an environmental standpoint, that would not be leading us to where we need to go. Several papers have shown that if you replace organic with conventional, or with conventional with added biotechnology, that you definitely increase performance of those animals by using, for example, biotechnologies and genetics and optimized feeding. And by increasing efficiency, you will decrease environmental footprint. In other words, it takes much larger herds to produce 1,000 tons of milk or meat with organic animals compared to with conventional animals. Now, that's counterintuitive. The public, by and large, doesn't know that. But the reason why biotechnologies are used is to increase efficiency, and efficiencies are directly linked to environmental performance. This is a slide that, again, comes from the FAO. It shows on the x-axis dairy in developed countries, dairy in non-developed countries, ruminant meat in developed countries, ruminant meat in non-developed countries, non-ruminant meat in developed countries, non-ruminant meat in non-developed countries. So what really sticks out is how high ruminant meat is in non-developed countries. This slide here shows ruminant meat versus dairy versus non-ruminant meat, and the different colors indicate different regions in the world. And what you see here is total output of greenhouse gases. That's basically showing that the United States on the ruminant side and the EU are much lower with respect to carbon footprints compared to, let's say, Brazil. Why is that? Brazil is still clear-cutting trees, so taking sinks for greenhouse gases out, and instead they're replacing those with forage land. So they're taking a sink out and they're putting a source in, and that contributes significantly to their carbon footprint. So there are very large differences in the carbon footprints, even within the same species across the world. It's a very large mistake to use global averages to describe livestock or even individual species, because there are such strong differences. And it's very important to be very specific with respect to the carbon footprint of a production regionally and certainly within species. You cannot compare at all broilers versus laying hens or beef versus dairy. They are totally different with respect to their contributions. This slide came from Henning Steinfeld, the author of one of the more prominent FAO publications. Production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. Production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. Basically, the more you produce, the less you emit, and vice versa. The less you produce, the more you emit per unit of product. But that does not mean that we should just go and build a bunch of super big CAFOs everywhere, and that's the solution. It just means that you have to balance, carefully balance, number of animals and then how they are housed and how they're kept, because animal welfare, food safety, all those issues are part of sustainability. People call it sustainable intensification, what I'm talking about. Sustainable intensification. Not to become less intensive, but to become more sustainable about intensification. So what you see here is, this is a way of decreasing numbers of animals to produce a unit of product. Improve fertility, improve health, improve genetics, and provide better diet to animals. These four tools will lead to a decrease in number of animals. Here you also see that there are other ways of decreasing methane, for example. This is a slide I love to show. It shows something that we see in California often. You see a fence line. On the one side of the fence, you see 1,000 happy California cows. On the other side, 1,000 unhappy California residents who moved there very recently. and who certainly claim that they have a much lower environmental impact than their peers on the other side of the fence. We have recently done a life cycle assessment just to see what is the environmental impact if you replace agricultural lands. And it was shocking to see what kind of fertilizer use is used over here, what kind of pesticide use is used over there, because people take their pesticide for their weeds and they squirt it on. Every little weed gets a little overdose of whatever is sprayed. The lawns get a lot of nitrogen fertilizers and so on. There's a lot of waste going on and environmental impact. And of course, these people all drive cars. Every house there has 2 cars. They all fly to their relatives twice a year, burning fossil fuels. So the carbon footprint, the environmental footprint of this land use is certainly not that much lower than the environmental footprint on this side. In fact, it has to be shown what all the different categories are. I just want to point out one more thing, and that is that you can use waste products, and we heard there are lots of waste products, and make them into acids. UC Davis, we have generated a biogas digester, which you see here, which not just receives animal waste, but also all different kinds of biomass. On campus, we have 40,000 students, 10,000 faculty and staff, and they produce a lot of food waste. We just heard from our first speaker that between 30 to 40% of the food purchased in this country goes to waste. 30 to 40% purchased in this country goes to waste, undigested, goes to landfills. So what we collect on campus goes into boxes like these ones here. Food leftovers are collected, green waste is collected, animal waste, and all of that, along with the organic portion of trash, goes into a facility that we are now building, which is pretty large, 30 tons a day, and all of that produces utilities, mainly methane. The methane is then converted into power and into fuel, and leads a large section of this campus to be off the grid. Can this be done in a real world? It can be. This is my last slide here. It shows the village where my parents live in Germany. They live in this house over there. These are digesters. And this village, which is 1,000 years old, has decided to get off the grid. They are collecting all their biomass, food waste, green clippings, paper, cardboard, and so on. Animal waste, of course. They put it in those digesters, and the digesters now produce enough power to run the entire village off the grid and heat from burning the gas, and that heat is going through an underground pipeline system into every household to provide warm water for shower and the heat for the radiators. So is it possible to help bridge this ag-urban interface? I think it is. With that, I'm at my end. Thank you very much.